Thank you.
Canada is putting an offer on the table, and it's more specific than anything Prime Minister Mark Carney has said publicly before. At a major summit in Toronto this weekend, Carney told an audience of international policy leaders and senior officials that Canada is open to deeper economic integration with the United States, but only in specific sectors and only under specific conditions. The sectors he highlighted were defense and technology. The framework he invoked was something called Fortress North America, and the condition he attached was direct. The United States needs to remove its unilateral tariffs first. That last part matters, because right now the KUSMA review, the mandatory reassessment of the Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement, is set to formally begin in July, and both governments are positioning themselves ahead of that process. This summit, the Global Progress Action Summit, co-hosted by Canadian and American progressive policy organizations, brought together cabinet ministers, international officials, and former heads of state. It was the kind of event where policy signals get sent in front of an audience designed to receive them. And what Carney signaled was that Canada is willing to talk about a closer North American economic relationship, but not unconditionally.
Let me give you some context on where this stands. Throughout 2025, Canada and the U.S. were engaged in a trade dispute that generated real economic damage on the Canadian side. Significant tariffs on roughly 12% of goods that saw major increases had a measurable impact on the Canadian economy, particularly because highly integrated supply chains across the Canada-US border make bilateral trade flows more sensitive to tariff changes than equivalent tariffs applied to offshore trading partners.
Canada did secure some exemptions during that period, but the broader dispute was never fully resolved. Trade talks were suspended in October 2025 after a diplomatic incident involving a provincial government advertisement, and they have not formally resumed. The formal KUSMA review begins in July, though Canadian trade officials have already made contact with their American counterparts to begin preparatory discussions. So Carney's comments at this weekend's summit are not happening in a vacuum. They are happening with a defined deadline on the horizon and a bilateral relationship that has been strained for over a year. The Fortress North America concept he referenced is not a new idea. It has been discussed in policy circles on both sides of the border as a way to frame North American economic cooperation in security terms rather than purely commercial ones. The 2026 KUSMA review has been described by some analysts as an opportunity to transform the agreement into the cornerstone of a secure, resilient, and competitive regional framework. What is notable here is that Carney is now using that language explicitly and attaching it to a conditional offer. So what exactly is Canada putting forward? Based on publicly available information from Carney's remarks and the broader policy context, the offer appears to center on two specific areas: defense procurement and technology cooperation. These are not arbitrary choices. They reflect real leverage points that Canada has been developing over the past year, and they connect to specific pressure points in the bilateral relationship. On the defense side, the Carney government has been reconsidering whether to complete its option to purchase a total of 88 F-35 fighter jets from the United States, a purchase worth approximately $28 billion. The government has also floated the possibility of partnering with a Swedish manufacturer instead to produce alternative aircraft domestically. That is a significant amount of leverage. A $28 billion procurement decision is not a minor detail. And the way Carney's government has been managing it, keeping the U.S. option open while simultaneously exploring alternatives, suggests it has been deliberately positioned as a negotiating tool. Publicly available statements from Canadian officials indicate that critical minerals have been handled similarly. Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister indicated that Ottawa was not prepared to sign a critical minerals agreement with the U.S. outside of the KUSMA framework. and that Ottawa wants to maximize returns to Canada from any such deal. In other words, Canada is not giving away its key assets in exchange for nothing. It is bundling them into a broader negotiation. On the technology side, the framing of Fortress North America connects to a broader argument that Carney has been making since at least January, when he spoke at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Carney has positioned Canada as an energy superpower with extensive reserves of critical minerals, arguing that the country is no longer relying solely on the strength of its values, but also the value of its economic and technological strength. The implication for technology cooperation is that Canada has assets the United States wants, particularly in clean energy, critical minerals, and digital infrastructure, and that integrating those assets more deeply into a North American framework could benefit both countries. But here is where the conditionality comes in again. Carney's position, as consistently stated, is that deeper integration requires reciprocal behavior from Washington. From Carney's perspective, the logic has been to address U.S. concerns that are politically salient in Washington, including defense spending and border enforcement, and convert these into the basis for a durable economic understanding. The problem is that the bilateral environment does not currently reward that kind of logic easily. Analysts have noted that the Trump administration's approach has been more transactional, where economic relief is contingent and reversible rather than the product of negotiated reciprocity. That tension has not been resolved. Here's where things become more complex. Carney's offer of deeper integration, conditional on tariff removal, raises a question that has not been fully answered publicly. What happens if the United States does not remove those tariffs before the July review begins? Because right now, that appears to be the realistic scenario. Trade talks have been suspended. The Ontario government's advertisement incident in October 2025 ended a period of active negotiation that Canadian officials described as the most substantive in some time. Since then, there has been contact, but not a resumed formal process. Canada was making important progress at the negotiating table before the ad began running in the United States. That progress was interrupted, and the path back to the table has been slow. Canada has sought to eliminate internal trade barriers and build new trade relationships abroad to reduce its reliance on the U.S. market. But those efforts are still in their early stages. So Canada is simultaneously making a conditional offer of closer integration with the U.S., while building alternatives in case that integration does not materialize. That is a coherent strategy, but it carries real risks. The deeper Canada integrates with alternative partners, the more the U.S. may perceive it as moving away from the North American framework. And the more Canada signals openness to U.S. integration, the less credible its leverage from alternative partnerships becomes. This adds an important layer to the story. The Fortress North America framing is not purely bilateral. It exists alongside Canada's active engagement with European partners, its newly signed trade and security arrangements with Australia and others, and its decision to lower tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for Chinese purchases of Canadian agricultural products. Canada has signed 12 separate trade and security deals across 4 continents in roughly 6 months, including a critical minerals arrangement with Australia and investment discussions with multiple European partners. This tells you something about how Carney is approaching the KUSMA review. He is not going in with only one option. He is building a portfolio of relationships so that the outcome of the U.S. negotiation, whatever it is, does not define Canada's entire economic trajectory. What stands out here is that Carney is simultaneously offering the U.S. a closer relationship and demonstrating that Canada can function without one. Those two things are in tension, and managing that tension over the next few months is going to require careful calibration. It is also worth noting the alternative perspective. Some Canadian analysts and business groups have argued that the conditionality in Carney's approach, demanding tariff removal before deeper integration can proceed, may actually slow negotiations rather than accelerate them. The argument is that offering integration as a reward for tariff removal gives the U.S. a reason to maintain tariffs as leverage, since removing them would reduce American negotiating power. From that perspective, a more transactional approach, offering specific integration steps in exchange for specific tariff reductions, might produce faster results. Carney's government has not fully embraced that framing, at least not publicly. At this point, the situation shifts toward a set of concrete, near-term tests. The KUSMA formal review begins in July. That is roughly 8 weeks away. Between now and then, both governments need to decide whether they are entering that review with a serious negotiating posture or whether the process will be largely procedural. Carney's comments this weekend suggest Canada is trying to establish a negotiating posture in advance, signaling what it is willing to offer and what it expects in return. Under the KUSMA framework, the three countries face a three-way choice: renew the deal for another 16 years, withdraw from it, or signal non-renewal without withdrawal, which triggers an ongoing annual review process. The U.S. position on this has been ambiguous. President Trump has publicly suggested the agreement could simply expire, while trade officials have indicated they expect a negotiating process similar to the original KUSMA talks. Canada's preference, publicly stated, is to renew the agreement, but on terms that reflect the current economic and security context, rather than simply extending the existing framework. What Fortress North America would actually look like in practice remains to be worked out. The concept has been discussed in policy documents as potentially including coordinated investment screening for national security purposes, aligned standards on critical minerals and supply chains, and deeper cooperation on defense procurement and technology development. Some analysts have argued that the KUSMA review should establish a formal North American Economic Security Committee to coordinate screening, export controls, and regional investment policy. Whether either government is prepared to go that far is not yet clear. There is also a domestic political dimension on both sides that deserves attention. Canada's economy is still under pressure, with per capita GDP depressed and the unemployment rate elevated, particularly affecting younger workers. Exports outside the United States jumped by 17% year over year in the 12 months ending in January 2026, which is a sign of diversification, but the country remains vulnerable to further trade disruptions. That economic context gives Carney some political urgency to reach a deal with Washington, but it also limits how long he can sustain an open-ended conditional offer without showing results. On the U.S. side, there are significant business interests that favor KUSMA renewal. Public hearings in Washington have included testimony from American industry groups defending the agreement on the grounds that deeply integrated supply chains make tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods effectively tariffs on American production as well. This raises a key question. Is Carney's offer at the Toronto summit a genuine opening bid for the July review, or is it a public signal designed to demonstrate reasonableness while the harder negotiating happens behind closed doors? Both interpretations are plausible. The language of Fortress North America is broad enough to mean different things to different audiences. And the conditionality, tariff removal before integration deepens, is specific enough to communicate a real position while leaving room for negotiation on the details. The next few weeks of diplomatic activity, and whether formal trade talks between Ottawa and Washington actually resume before July, will probably tell us more about the realistic prospects here than any single summit speech. Where do you think this goes next?